everyone is well. Thank you. So we have an agenda that we've got with CARES update and equitable services that Ken Bailey and Jack O'Connor are going to be doing. And McCall Flynn, I hope you're on, is also going to be sharing possibly an update on the CARES dollars that is flowing through the governor's office for K-12 as much as for post-secondary. I hope all are healthy. So, Mr. Bailey, if you could please.
All right, well, let me get caught up on other stuff, and whenever you have more time, we can keep moving these.
Hi, good morning. This is Ken, and that background's not coming from me. The CARES Act we're approved for, I think as everyone knows, our application was approved and we have the ability to provide that money to schools. Where we're at now is working on the mechanics of how we do that through e-grants. We need to open up a module, and in that module, schools will have to, first of all, sign on the assurances, which is all of the conditions of the grant. Second, I think we're set now that we're going to categorize expenditures into some buckets that I think we've finalized now, and that will allow us to capture how the money is spent going forward. And the schools will have to enter a budget basis for that. Then I think there's also a requirement before the money can actually go to schools is to complete the equitable services calculation. And Jack will talk about that when we get to it. So I guess the most important thing right now to understand is that we're working with the vendor of e-grants to get that module up and running, which we hope to do by the end of this week. That will then require us to do some testing to make sure everything's working correctly. So we would anticipate opening this module to the schools sometime next week. But again, as Jack will talk about, I think the critical path is really going to be the equitable services piece. And I think another thing I just want to add in, there was some feedback that came to us from a couple of sources, but in particular, one representative saying that in our guidance about what you could do with the money, we weren't completely clear as to saying that the money has to be used for activities that are in response to or providing for or anticipating the impacts of the coronavirus. And we will add that into the assurances to make sure that that is the intent of this grant. It's not completely open to spend it on anything at all. The activities have to be in relation to the coronavirus. So let me pause there and see if anyone's got any questions about the general use and distribution of the funds.
So Ken, this is Kirk, and just a question. I know that there were just new federal regulations or from the Department of Ed about distribution to private schools. Is that the impact that you're talking about that Jack is going to talk to us? I think that just came out like within the last day or two.
Yeah, Jack, I'll let Jack address the equitable services, and that of course is the services provided to schools. But no, what I'm really referring to is that, say, a school district has always wanted to have a tent, right? And say, so here's some money, let's buy a tent. That would not be an acceptable use of these funds unless the activity is specifically related to, again, responding to, reacting to what happened with the coronavirus, or anticipating a need that the school district has to reopen due to the coronavirus. That's what I'm referring to as far as the specific use related to the coronavirus.
Thank you. And so an anticipated budget shortfall in the ensuing year as a result of the coronavirus, is that, that could be identified either by hiring staffing through the summer or to hire staffing for the beginning of next year as a result of the coronavirus. Are we believing that potentially is an appropriate expenditure?
I think that's a great question, Kirk, and it's not one that's been posed to me before, because you're kind of paraphrasing it to say, can these funds from the CARE Act be used to cover a revenue shortfall due to the coronavirus? And I'm going to have to think about that, because it doesn't specifically say that it can be used for that. And there's been a lot of talk about the government doing separate funding for covering shortfalls of revenue for different government entities. So again, I think that's a great question, and I won't give you a definite answer right now.
Thanks. Appreciate your interpretation of that, because I think that's probably on the minds of every single school district and the superintendent going into this next year.
Yeah.
Hey, Ken, this is Lance. I just want to back up on one thing, and it's probably nitpicky, but with your reference to a tent, what if a district needed the tent in order to provide for an outdoor graduation ceremony with physical distancing?
Yeah, I totally agree. What I was trying to say is, again, school districts can't take the needs that they've had that they haven't been able to find a way to fund and then say, well, here's a pot of money, let's do those things that we've always wanted to do. Again, I think for any expenditure, at some point the auditors are going to show up, and because of the size of this grant, I can practically guarantee that this will be one of the areas that they decide to look at, particularly those schools that get a single audit. And again, there has to be justification for the expenditures.
Yeah, and I'm fully prepared for that, and I think our members are as well. But I'll tell you that my experience with auditors at times is that you find yourself having to justify it not just by purpose, but by exclusivity of purpose. Frankly, I've had auditors who would have said in response to the question I just posed, yeah, as long as you throw it in the garbage when you're done and don't ever use it for any other purpose. So, I think that we're going to need OPI's help, and this is a longstanding issue that transcends decades, and we've gotten great support from OPI in recent years on some of those audits where people are really straining the credibility of the audit by trying to be overly regulatory. But I'm just pointing out a district might very well have wanted to have a tent on its wish list forever, and it might now have the very necessity that's going to result in purchasing that in order to safely conduct a graduation ceremony, after which it may use it for other purposes.
No, and I agree with you, Lance, and the idea of buying assets always poses some problems for federal grants. For example, I did have a superintendent who sent me the question, can I use these funds to buy a car for my co-op? And my response was I wouldn't recommend it for partly some of the same reasons. In a federal grant, if you buy an asset at the end of the grant, and the end of this grant could be construed as the end of next September, you have an obligation to either give it back to the feds, get their permission to keep it, or transfer it to another federal program. So by doing something like that, you're kind of incurring that need to do some administrative things. And what I said to that superintendent was, but if you rented a car, I have no qualms about this at all. So.
Yeah, it's about the timing of the use and the distinction between an operational and a capital expense. I'm with you on that. That would be the same answer I would give is, load it up. If you've got special transportation obligations that you didn't have before and that arise out of COVID, then absolutely lease that van and use it for purposes of transportation if it complies with the bus standards, and just don't buy something that's going to have a 10-year life for a 3-year grant or a 3-month grant.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions of Mr. Bailey?
Yes, Ken, this is Dennis. Can you remind me again the end of the term when the money needs to be spent by? And then I know we've kind of talked around it, but do you have any specific guidance either from the Department of Ed or decisions that have been made within the agency around supplement and supplant?
So yes, there are 3 dates that are important to the grant. The first is that the OPI has a year to distribute the funds from this grant. Any money that we haven't distributed to schools in April of 2021 goes back to the federal government. The grant period for the schools runs through September of 2021. So what that means is that the schools have until then to decide and make obligations for that money. But the tidings amendment or waiver will apply to this so that they will have an additional year to September 2022 to actually expend the funds, is my understanding of that right now. Sorry, the second question, Dennis.
The conversation that's ensued just prior to my question, it was related to supplement and supplant, but do you have anything more specific either from the Department of Ed or from within the agency there?
So the most tenuous of guidance, there was a webinar with the CCSSO where they had a consultant who had been in discussion with the Department of Education. And they actually put onto a slide that there is not going to be a supplement versus supplant regulation specifically for the CARES funds. But man, I sure want to see that in writing from the department, and still waiting to see that. I think it's particularly important because the grant is structured so that it allows pre-award costs. So in other words, if a school, and back to the date of March 13th. So for example, if a school district went out and had to buy things to set up remote learning, they can use these funds to kind of reimburse themselves for that. And since that kind of expenditure was, could have been made from a couple of different sources, but say it was just made with general fund, would schools have to worry about, are we doing a supplanting by replacing that funding with these federal dollars? And I believe the answer would be, don't worry about it. But man, like I said, I really want to see that in writing from the department.
Thanks, Ken.
Perfect. Any other questions for Mr. Bailey? And he's very readily available in case something happens after our discussion here. So let's move on then. So Jack O'Connor is here to discuss equitable services.
All right, thanks Elsie, and thanks everybody for joining the Zoom meeting. As with regular equitable share for private school participation, that we would normally do during the year for titles 1, 2, 3, and 4. The CARES Act is just as complicated and convoluted as those as we would do during the normal year, and so this is going to leave a series of steps that districts are going to have to do to allow the non-public schools in the state to participate in CARES Act funding. During a normal course of the year, county superintendents are required by law to get the names of all the private schools and non-publics, and in Montana, non-public schools are also homeschools. They're in that mix. And then they gather that information and put it in the OPI web application. And then each spring, districts have to go out and notify all of the private non-public schools within their district boundaries of their intent to participate in federal programs, which they have already completed. The CARES Act, however, is going to require that the districts go out and do this again, specifically to CARES Act funding. And so we are in the process right now of developing a letter to go out to districts, which we're hoping to either send out, well, we're hoping to send out by the end of this week, letting districts know that they are going to have to contact all of the non-public schools within their district boundaries of their right to participate in CARES Act funding. And then with that, there's going to be, the districts have to send out a letter, basically a certified letter to those entities, and then give them a time period to return that letter to the district stating whether or not they want to participate, or in the case of many of our home schools in Montana, they don't even return them at all. Then the districts are going to have to enter that information into a special section of our private school web application so that we know who all is participating in the private and non-public school sector. And then on that, they'll also have to have the number of students. For most of our federal funding, especially under Title I, the amount of funding that goes out to a non-public is based upon the number of enrolled students in the public school, the number of free and reduced kids in the public school, compared to the number of enrolled students and the number of free and reduced lunch students in a non-public school. However, under the CARES Act, it is just on the total number of students. And so the district is going to have to help in our grant application. We'll have to develop, or well, they'll enter basically the number of students they have and the number of students in the participating non-publics to determine the proportional share of dollars that will go out. Once they have done that, then they'll also, well, actually during this time period, be doing any consultation processes with the participating non-public schools to figure out exactly what they want to use their federal funding on. The rules for uses of those federal funds don't change between what's in the Every Student Succeeds Act and the CARES Act. For example, any materials purchased will belong to the public school district. Any services they would want instructionally will be provided by the public school district. So none of those things will change. And so that's kind of the gist of what we're working on right now. And I will go ahead and take any questions.
Thank you, Jack. Any questions for Mr. O'Connor?
Jack, this is Kirk. Thank you for the review of those regulations. It's my understanding that with new guidance that was just issued by the department, that non-public schools are able to count all students for the potential allocation as opposed to the public school environment. It was distributed through Title I and those that qualified for Title I, and that's how we figured out the dollar distribution. Can you verify for me that that in fact is the case? So what will end up happening with the amount of that $41.3 million that's coming and about 39 or 37 million that is going to be distributed through this fund? How is that funding breakdown going to end up going to the non-public environment? Because we've already allocated to the basics to Title I and then $10,000 for non-Title I schools, and those that have low enrollment Title I are not full programs. Can we speak to that? Maybe Ken needs to speak to that.
Well, I can start it. So yes, it'll be the total number of students in the private or non-public school, again, because of the homeschool. They will get counted in the mix instead of just the low income number, which would determine the proportional share under Title I. And that's why on the application, not really the application for funds, but the intent to participate forms, the non-public school will put in their total number of students. And then that will go into the calculations to determine the proportional share. Just for example, we were just working with some numbers this morning. If a district were to get $1 million and they had 10,000 students and then there were 2,000 eligible private school students, you're looking at about $80-some, that would go out, that could be used for any individual student in the private school as their equitable share portion, which isn't, a significant amount.
Right, and I want to make sure that everybody understands that yes, private schools are using their total enrollment, but so is the calculation going to use the total enrollment of public schools, so that the proportion is based upon that. And I guess I would say that for those cases where we awarded a minimum of $10,000 to some low enrollment schools, the actual dollars per student in those cases will be higher than at other school districts.
Any other questions for Mr. Bailey or for Jack? Thank you. So McCall, I know you're on the line. Thank you for participating. Any updates that you'd like to give us?
Yeah, good morning, Superintendent. We had a meeting a couple weeks ago to discuss not only the GEAR Fund, but just other education asks. As you probably know, the Governor's Office, in conjunction with Department of Commerce, set up a kind of a entry form online. So we've been getting lots of feedback from folks on how they think that we should be spending these dollars. We do not have any specific information to share right now, but definitely still working through the process and receiving feedback and suggestions, and we're working through those as we receive them.
Thank you, McCall. Any questions of McCall? Perfect. At this point then, anyone else, any of those that are part of MONPEC or would like to share what is working and how things are moving with the entities that you support? So, Mr. Parman, Dennis, I know that you are looking at rural schools. Do we have any schools that might be opening fully at this point that we know of? I know there are some that may be looking at a different model than when pre-COVID. Anything to share in that regard?
Thank you, Superintendent. I have about 120 schools definitively entered into our spreadsheet that we're sharing, and thanks to Christine for helping populate that. There's maybe a half dozen that I've categorized as partial. The one school that is a little more on the partial to the full opening, but certainly not a full opening, is Circle. They're doing a number of things that the other partials aren't. The ones that are doing what they've called a partial opening, they're focusing on students with specific needs, in particular, I think probably seniors in high school, making sure that they meet the graduation requirements so they can graduate. But other than that, I think it's about 6 right now. Everyone else has made a formal decision at the table of the Board of Trustees to continue with the distance delivery systems that they've been using up until this point.
Thank you, Dennis. So I do know then the discussions that I've had with school leaders, they are using the policies that the School Boards Association has done, and one of those is an opt-out, and I do believe there's also possibly an opt-in. So a big shout out for that. I know that has been very, very helpful for the leaders that I've spoken to. So thank you, Emily, if you're on, or Lance, if you are. I appreciate that, because I know that's coming from them as well. Anything else? Marco, anything at all? I don't know if you're on the line.
I have nothing.
Superintendent Arnson, this is Lance.
Thank you, Lance.
Really quickly. We might be using criteria slightly different than Dennis, but I think we're getting close to the same results. We conducted a survey of our members, and we've got 5 asserting that they're going in person. But even then, there's I would call it majority in person with options for online to accommodate both student wishes as well as staff accommodations under ADA, and then 19 that are blended. And there's actually quite a few of them that are doing that in creative ways. It might be committing to serving students under IEPs in person, or bringing students in for intense instruction and assessment to ensure proficiency and bring them up to speed. And then 147 just saying off-site, total of 171 responses. And the other thing that you may have spoken about this last week, and I apologize I missed, but the MTPEC came out with what I think is going to be very helpful guidance that gives practical guidance to school districts about how to conduct graduation ceremonies, specifically on a football field, because of the standardization of that format and using typical sizes, using the enrollment figures from OPI to help that out. So, you know, roughly speaking, looking at if you're a large A or a double A, multiple ceremonies necessary with virtual observation by guests, all the way down to a small C that has plenty of room to have the graduates and many more guests than they will probably need in that format. So it just actually maps it out and shows over conservative compliance with the social distancing every 5 yards, both directions. So, you know, somebody at the center of a 15-foot buffer around them, which we think helps accommodate people that are going to get up and wave to somebody, for example, or to be able to have room to move to an aisle and get back safely. And that was something that MTPEC pulled together just kind of very, very quickly. You guys have probably already discussed it previously, but I think that is just kind of an example of how the groups are working to really collaborate and find a common voice so that people can rely on it.
Thank you, Lance. Kirk?
Yes, so I'm just reading an article right now that came out about 2 hours ago that Willow Creek School is one of the first in the nation to reopen fully. And so that's in the IR, online in the IR.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate the efforts of Dennis to try to, you know, collect all of the data on what schools are doing, and also Lance, you know, hopefully share that information so that we're aware of who's working on those efforts, the different kinds of efforts. And then I would just say that from our members, what I'm hearing mostly is what kind of guidance and advice are we going to be able to rely on going into the summer and for the fall on reopening, and what that looks like, say social distancing, if that order is lifted at some point, how does it look different? And my responses have been to my members that we really believe that the initial document that was created by the Montana Safe Schools Advisory Committee on reopening after the pandemic will be updated with the latest of information, both from an academic the 5 categories that were basically on that document. So I've been using that with our members to just point them to that document is an ongoing document. And as we know more about what the summer looks like and potentially what the fall looks like, that we would want to focus our attention on guidance that's coming from one place that we all agree to. And so that agreement basically is the Safe Schools Advisory Committee taking a look at what it is and endorsing it. So I'm putting that out there for everybody to weigh in on, you know, to find, is that the right resource that we should be all kind of pointing toward at this point?
Thank you for mentioning the safety committee. Worked really hard with great members and appreciate your input. Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. Do we have, Dan, I see that you're part of this as well. You've had a lot of Zoom meetings. Is anything in your members, any questions that maybe we can help find solutions to? I put him on the spot. Diane, anything from you? Diane Burke?
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Dan.
Sorry, I have my screen down and I couldn't get myself unmuted. we've just had a round with our membership, trying to assess how they feel about what they've been doing and where it possibly is going to go. And not many of them are opening up. There's been a couple that thought they would at the beginning of our Zoom meetings with them, but by the end, it seemed like their board weighed the value or I guess the cost benefit, because most of our schools are done early. So I think the majority of them are down for the year, even though it would be easier for them to open up with their smaller numbers. But we had those meetings, and I think the fear is next fall and what could happen. So our efforts at the MSSA, we just had a board meeting. We're going to try to have a virtual with all of our membership this summer to prepare them for the event of something again uncertain, changing the direction in the fall, and then follow that up again early again in the fall. So once in July, once again in probably October or September. Otherwise, you know, they've handled it pretty well. They're pretty courageous people, like all of us, I believe, in education.
Thank you, Dan, for those reflections. And Diane.
Thank you, Superintendent. I don't have anything to add at this time.
You're very kind. Thank you for being short and sweet. And I also, we have the Board of Public Ed. Pete, are you available?
Yeah, thank you, Superintendent. Just wanted to remind everyone that the board will be meeting via Zoom at starting at 8:30 on Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. That's also my birthday. It's good to have a birthday at the Board of Public Ed. So that's good. Okay, I know I also have, I don't know, Pat, if you're on, I know there is an interim committee this afternoon. And he probably might be very busy with that. As a reflection, we have, and I know Angela had to jump off, but we do have a discussion with post-secondary on that. I think there are 5 agenda items. We do have Linda Ross, you're on, and I believe you're going to be partaking this afternoon as well. So our Teacher of the Year for this year, Linda, any ideas or reflections regarding the meeting or how you are working with your students in Baker? Linda might have had to jump off. So Dylan Huskin, are you on as well? Give us some thoughts of what's happening in Bonner. And that might have been also where he had to jump off. It is Teacher Appreciation Week, and we are having a grab and go barbecue. We're trying out some new hamburgers that through USDA that our nutrition unit has gone ahead and given us. So if you're anywhere near and around the OPI, come on down, just roll your window down and we'll give you a couple burgers and a bag of chips, and want to say thank you to the McDonald's. They allowed us to get us some ketchup packets that we could put in. We do this every year around this time, and as a teacher myself, we can reflect, my goodness, they're working so diligently at this point. So I want to give a big shout out to all our teachers across our state, and also to our parents who now have that math book and everything else in front of them, looking at what distance and remote learning looks like. We also want to say that we have a robust group and putting a phase 1 into play at what the OPI looks like. If you have any suggestions on how we can serve your members after we get out of phase 1 and get into phase 2, we'd be more than happy to sit and listen and see how we can better serve our students. If there is nothing else good for the order, I appreciate you being on for this half hour, and I wish everyone great health. So thank you for participating and putting our Montana students first. Thank you. Stay well. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Be
Thank
well.
you.